All right.
All right. Well, happy Friday again. It's good to have you here, Sam. Like I said, we had spoken some time ago and life happened and time happened. So I just wanted to reconnect with you, see how things are going, and tell us a little bit about what's been going on since we last spoke about the beginning of this year.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, so I've been good. It's been, a interesting process of, you know, over the past couple of years now, really, working to not like necessarily rebuild, but uh, sort of reimagine and build out a data infrastructure and analysis that goes beyond, I think, what we had, years ago, what had been available up to date. Really trying to move beyond a focus that is exclusively on cases that are reported in the media where people are killed by the police, to a broader examination of like where are the cases that we're missing, that we're not tracking, where are the non-fatal use of force cases, and police shootings that hit somebody but they might have survived, but nevertheless, like those police departments often have very high rates of police violence, and nevertheless might not show up on the radar if we only look at fatal incidents and we don't include all of the non-fatal incidents that they're involved in as well. So trying to expand the analysis, deepen the analysis, better understand the trajectory of police violence across the country, and like more importantly, trying to identify like where are those places where things might actually be improving, where we might actually be seeing some sustained and substantial reductions in use of force, or in racial disparities in policing, in police funding, and the number of officers and the size of the sort of police and carceral state. So that's really what my focus has been.
Yeah, and just a level set for the audience, you've been doing huge work as far as social justice is concerned. You've grassroots efforts, I want to call it, in terms of putting together a database to help us have more transparency, or begin to have more transparency around police interactions, or to be more clear about police killings or things that have happened in that nature. I do know from just looking at reading some things on social media that, I don't know, you may have rebranded yourself, or maybe just to first start off with a little bit, just to level set, some of the work that you have done.
Yeah, so founded Mapping Police Violence way back in 2015, which really has emerged as a database tracking killings by the police, and as I was saying a little bit earlier, expanding now to include non-fatal police violence as well. Co-founded Campaign Zero, and was involved with policy advocacy work with Campaign Zero for many years, up until a couple of years ago. And now really building out the Mapping Police Violence organization to have a deeper and sustained focus on collecting, using data as a tool to fight police violence across the country, and building out and expanding our understanding of police violence by going beyond fatal incidents to understand sort of the full breadth of police violence in this country, how we can better track it, assess it, and identify ways to stop it.
Yeah, and I know that you've also done a dashboard with Tableau. You teamed up with them, and they actually helped as well.
Yeah, so like even thinking about as we do this like expansion, one of the big data projects that we've really led has been the Police Scorecard project, which is a database that houses all of these indicators that have to do with policing. So non-fatal police shootings rates, arrest rates, police funding levels, racial disparities in arrests, homicide clearance rates, police accountability rates when it comes to civilian complaints, and putting all that in one place so that you can get access to all the data that we can reasonably get and obtain under existing public records laws, and use that to evaluate and assess policing in each city. Like that's been a huge project, and Tableau has been like a key partner in helping to visualize some of the findings from that analysis. And so, as I said, we're working to expand that data now to contain data now for 2021. So like we're doing public records requests to thousands of agencies to get back data for 2021 full year data. We have data now going back, good data back to 2016, and for large cities going back to 2013 across those indicators. And so, so just continuing to build. I mean, this is a country with 18,000 different law enforcement agencies that all have their own different processes and databases and systems and procedures for collecting and reporting data. There are all these different public records laws that limit access to what you can get in each state. So really it is trying to break through some of that inconsistency and create some standards and data collection processes that can better track things across the country. So hopefully we can better identify solutions.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the interesting things when, you know, I started looking more into your project or was sat in on some meetings about, you know, it's surprising and it's not in terms of like how uniform like each police structure is like, but I think what surprised me with that was just the variance, like how different it can be from almost, I don't know, even within the same state, it can be different. So, I mean, from a data perspective, yeah, that was definitely interesting to me as well. And it makes it hard, I can imagine, like to really score, you know, when because some of the scoring maybe, or maybe some of the dynamics between precincts or organizations is probably like apples to oranges. And it's hard to maybe find like, I don't know if there was a way that you were able to stratify, is that the right word, or normalize the scoring.
Yeah, so I mean that is like the fundamental challenge to creating any type of nationwide database that's tracking policing. Now it is not like an insurmountable challenge; it's just a huge challenge. So you know there are other examples of detailed, complicated national databases tracking, you know, issues that are just as complex in a much better way than I think the government has done when it comes to policing. You know, you look at education, and the U.S. Department of Education, their Office of Civil Rights Data Collection publishes data on every school in America, where you can see granular disaggregated data on the total number of kids by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by disability status, how many kids are getting referred to law enforcement or suspended in class, in school, out of school, who's getting in, you know, gifted and talented programs, who's not. Like they track all of this for every school in America. I mean, we're talking about way more schools than there are police departments. And they're doing it in a standardized and systematic way and publishing the data so that anybody can look up their schools. So that is happening. The federal government is doing that. But when it comes to policing, they're sort of like, well, this is too complex. We don't know how to do it. It's impossible. There are too many police departments. They don't want to comply and share their data. And they create a whole bunch of excuses why they can't do it. So that's why this project exists, because the government's not providing any type of useful standardized data that can help us answer some of these questions about police violence. But to actually do that work that the government's not doing, of course, isn't easy. Like this is not like a simple thing to solve. And I'll give you some examples. You know, when it comes to police use of force, for example, you know, there are many different ways in which a given police department will track police use of force. So if you're in police department A, they might do use of force reporting at the incident level. So let's say there are 3 police officers who use each of them uses a taser 2 times against the same person. Okay, so 3 officers, each has a taser. They both use it twice against this person. In some departments, they would classify that as one use of force incident. There was one incident in which force was used, regardless of the number of officers or people involved or number of times taser is used. In other departments, they might say, you know what, there were 3 uses of force because there were 3 officers using force. In another department, they would say there were 6 uses of force because each officer used force twice, and there were 3 officers. So depending on the way in which they've internally adopted policies and procedures for reporting these incidents, even depending on something as simple as what is the form that they're using and what fields are available in that form that they're using to track use of force, it can be drastically different, like what the actual use of force totals that you're getting from those departments actually mean, and how you can actually compare them across agencies. So that's like that's the complex part, is not only getting the data, which is like itself a challenge, and there are all these issues with police not wanting to provide the data or refusing to provide it, or public records laws not requiring them to provide some aspects of data. But then there's the challenge of, once you get it, how do you make sense of it in a way that you can compare across all of these different agencies? So one of the things that we do is we look at sort of what is that like lowest common denominator. What can we find across all of these agencies that tends to be reported in common, that tends not to be susceptible to some of these reporting differences? And it tends to be that a couple of things. One, less lethal force is reported far more consistently than other types of force. Less lethal meaning force involving a weapon. So basically there's lethal force, which is like when the police shoot somebody, choke somebody, etc. Less lethal force is a term which refers to all of these other types of force that are technically not considered deadly force, but actually could cause a lot of harm, and in some cases do actually kill people. So, using a baton against somebody, or pepper spray, or a taser, or a police canine, like serious uses of force causing a lot of harm. And then there's the rest of use of force, which is like your punches, kicks. Some departments, they will track other things that other departments won't. So some departments, it'll be if you tackle somebody to the ground, that's a use of force. Some departments, if you point a weapon at somebody but don't use it, it's a use of force. And in some weapons, in some departments, if you verbally use like de-escalation techniques or talk to the person, that's included in their use of force data. So like there's verbal techniques is like a category. So it's all over the place. What we do is we focus on the most serious uses of force that are most likely to be reported in common across all of these different agencies. We also get information on like how the department's reporting use of force in the data that they provide. And then we stratify it by size of the police department or size of the jurisdiction. So, places with 250,000 people or more are in one category, like small towns are in another category, mid-sized cities are another category. And then police departments are in one category and sheriff's departments are in another category. There's different jurisdictions and mandates, et cetera. So that's a lot of complexity. Thanks for being with me, but like, that's why it's important to think about and consider all of these inconsistencies and design a process that can try to standardize this across, so we can begin to actually make meaningful findings out of this.
Yeah, there's so many things going through my head. Like, I wonder if we can even stratify it. Maybe we should report it. I don't even know how we would segment it. Like, yeah, just a few things. Like maybe it's not even possible to stratify it across the country, or maybe we need to segment. But one thing I definitely wanted to circle back with you on was when you were talking about the use of force and how it's reported, how 3 cops could be using a taser on someone and it can be counted 3 times, 6 times, or 1 time. Now, can we at least hope that the reporting in that department, that it's reported consistently? Like, so for example, if that scenario happens in a particular department, is it always reported the same way? Or were you talking about how it's done differently across different departments?
So there's the consistency across, like comparing one department with another department. There's also that internal consistency over time, which can change. So particularly after the protests after the murder of George Floyd, a number of states and cities adopted new policies expanding use of force reporting. So you have places like San Francisco did this in 2015 or 16. Oakland did this even before that. But a number of departments are now catching up to that standard, where now many police departments are starting to report what they call shows of force or threats of force, which is essentially like if the officer points a taser at you, threatens to use it, but doesn't actually use it against you, they're now required to document that in some agencies, especially if they point like a gun at you. Now, what that means is if we're just looking at the use of force totals year over year, like you see a huge spike. You see this in San Francisco, for example. I think it's between 2014 and 15 or between 15 and 16, where they began implementing the new reporting requirements around threats of force. And so the total number of use of force incidents increased dramatically that year because they were reporting more things than they had reported previously. So that's why like the data is also disaggregated in a way that we're looking at the total number of uses of force by type of force, so that we can isolate out those additional force categories that are added in over time across agencies. That tends to standardize across time. There are some exceptions where, like the department, so Minneapolis is a huge example of this. And I don't think that this was done just by coincidence. But I think when you look at Minneapolis's open data portal, they have a use of force dashboard, and it basically shows that there's a huge increase in use of force around 2020 and then onwards. Now, you look at that, you look at Minneapolis, you think about what was happening in Minneapolis in 2020, you had the murder of George Floyd. You could just look at that data and be like, oh, like there was a huge increase. They're off the charts now with use of force. Something is really out of control in Minneapolis. But then they put a caveat there that they changed their use of force reporting in 2020. And they don't tell you how, or how comparable that is to the prior years. They don't tell you how to do the work of making it comparable or standardizing it across those years. They just give you the raw data. They tell you you can't compare these two because there was a change. They don't tell you what the change was or how it impacts the numbers. And then you see this huge increase. So it's almost like they designed it. Like if you were to design a system that would cover up an increase in use of force around the time that the whole world was looking at your city for police violence, like you would almost design the system like they did it. That makes it impossible to reverse engineer, given the information they've provided, whether use of force is increasing or decreasing since the murder of George Floyd. Gotcha. So you do see those tricks. You do see that in some agencies, some cities. And part of this project is like figuring out where those places are and shining a spotlight and saying, what's actually going on here? Like, why? Like, is this just a coincidence or is this something more nefarious?
Yeah. When we were scheduling this, this discussion for us to sit down together, I found it a little ironic, especially looking at the calendar yesterday and then, waiting to meet with you today about, we just heard about, news around Breonna Taylor's case. And I definitely needed to make sure that I made a note just to ask your thoughts and reflections on that, hearing that news about the arrests that have been made with 4 officers.
Yeah, I mean, so one, I mean, I'm glad that finally we're seeing some action. I was surprised. This was unexpected to me. I mean, it's been considerable amount of time, right? It's been years.
2 years.
And this was something that was sort of happening under the radar in terms of the federal case moving, or the DOJ's actions in this case. I mean, we saw Attorney General in Kentucky just completely try to evade any type of responsibility for holding those officers accountable. So I think it's good news, but at the same time, like the broader context is one in which, for 98% of cases, no officers are charged. 98% of cases where people are killed by the police, no officers are charged with a crime. And for fewer than 1% of all cases, an officer is convicted of a crime. And once convicted, officers get lesser sentences than civilians convicted of the same crimes. So if an officer is convicted of, let's say, involuntary manslaughter, like they tend to get a lower than average sentence length for those convictions. So I think that's like the caveat here is like, this is good news, but I'm not, I wouldn't be surprised to see that case ultimately not result in a conviction, particularly at the federal level, which is even less likely than when a state or even local DA presses charges. So that's sort of the context, but it's still good news because it was, this is better than having nothing happen, having no officers charged, and not even having a chance at the criminal justice system holding them accountable.
Yeah. In your opinion, do you believe like this work that you've been doing has made some impact? When you look out at, first what drives you to do this work, and then do you feel like in your journey with it, because you've been doing this for a while now, do you feel a sense of, I'm making a difference?
So I think, yes. But I think on the indicator that matters the most, which is, are we actually reducing the number of people who are being killed by the police? I think it's still, an open question. I think we, in this data collection process, the step one was really collecting the data that could help tell a story about and communicate the scale of this issue. And I think that many years, from 2014, 15, 16, much of my work was focused on like, how do we collect this data and talk about how widespread police violence is, because people just don't believe it, particularly white people, policymakers. Like, they would just dismiss each case. Like, they would say, well, this is an isolated incident, or maybe this one officer in this one case was a quote unquote, bad apple officer, but the system as a whole is sound, or the system as a whole shouldn't be challenged. And that was sort of the narrative early on. I think that now I think that all of the people who would be convinced that this is a nationwide and systemic issue are now convinced that it is. And I don't think that there's much upside. Like, I don't think there's like an additional group of people that, like, if we just had one additional piece of data or information on top of this mountain of evidence that's been compiling since 2014, like, that would be enough to just move a huge segment of the population. I don't think that is the work anymore. Like, I think that the utility has sort of expended when it comes to that piece of the work. And I think that piece, like, I think that the data was instrumental in making the case for why this was widespread, how widespread it was, the fact that 1,100 people killed by police a year, 3 people every day. I'm talking about the disparities of Black people 3 times more likely to be killed by police, more likely to be unarmed, talking about particular places that had more police violence, shining a spotlight on those places so that local organizers would have some of the cover that they needed to move through systemic changes. So I think that work actually, like, that did make a difference. I think that those goals were accomplished in large part to the extent that they could be. But I think when we get to the next phase of this, which is now that as many people as we might convince of this problem are convinced, how do we move that core, like, critical mass of power? How do we leverage that power to move through policies that can transform and completely change these dynamics, not sort of incrementally or along the margins make an impact, but how do we leverage the data and the information to really substantially impact police violence rates? And I think that piece has yet to happen. I think that there are places that are doing some of that work and doing it well, but at the national level, like, that's now the challenge, and it's even harder because you have this backlash around crime. That I think makes it even more difficult to move anything through, let alone some of the more transformative changes that I think the data suggests need to happen.
Yeah. Another question I wanted to ask too. I remember we had spoken before, and you told us, you shared with us your story about what sparked, we're going to call it, your activism back in 7th grade. You mind sharing a little? Oh, it was 6th grade. Okay.
Because I left that school after 6th grade. I was like, all right, I'm out of there. Like, I ain't about it.
Yeah, I know you were telling me you told us you were in a school in Florida, and
yep.
Yeah, and that put the activist bug in you.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, so it's there. Growing up, as I don't know, it's like a Black man in America. Like, I don't know, this is not unique. Right? I feel like every time, I don't know, I feel like this is like, I'm not like special. My experience wasn't like, a standout, whatever, like uniquely bad or anything. Like I was a kid in school, and I was like a Black boy in 6th grade, one of like almost every other Black boy in 6th grade in America right now who is more likely to be pushed out of school, disciplined unfairly for things that other kids are doing, suspended, etc., referred to law enforcement, all these things. So that's like, that experience was enough to teach me that the world was not very fair, that something was going on. And, after 6th grade, like growing up, that was only reinforced and reaffirmed by further experiences, both in Florida and like all across the country. So
yeah, because you'd actually for people who may not follow you, you actually was you're in education policy. Your journey had you in education policy for quite a while before you, I would say, switch over to this and with the police violence mapping.
Yeah.
Michael Brown is actually what I think triggered you from what I remember last. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I was focused on really school to prison pipeline issues. How do we stop kids from getting pushed out of school, particularly, you know, black boys and girls who were more likely to be suspended, referred to law enforcement, expelled, you know, criminalized. And that was based on my experience, you know, growing up. I was impacted by that, and I wanted to make a difference in addressing that, you know, at a structural level. And then, you know, my life changed in two moments really that I think changed so many people. I think the first was when Trayvon Martin was murdered and George Zimmerman acquitted, in part because that was in Central Florida. Like, I'm from Orlando, Florida. That's where I grew up. Like, I went to soccer practice in Sanford where this was. Like, I would be the kid who got dropped off by the city bus and like walked the rest of the way home through like a suburban neighborhood, stopped at 7-Eleven, got a Arizona sweet tea and Skittles or Starburst, and like would walk the rest of the way home like every single day.
So much sugar.
Well, yeah. I can't do that.
Don't mean to make light of that, but yes.
Yeah. Thinking back, that was like, like all I ate was fast food and like candy. So don't do that. But yeah, I mean, like that was so when Trayvon Martin was murdered for like being a kid, like doing the same thing, like that, that felt like it hit closer to home, just the location and the circumstance. And then after that, seeing Mike Brown murdered and Officer Darren Wilson not end up being held accountable. I mean, that was something that really sort of catalyzed the fact that like this is happening a lot. Like the state is like intimately involved in taking lives. And not only that, but after that, we quickly learned that like they weren't even collecting data on this. Like the federal government wasn't able to provide even basic information on how often this was happening. And that really was the moment where you know, I was like, there has to be a way to get this information. The data is such a powerful tool. It has been a powerful tool. You know, it was a tool in my work in working in school to prison pipeline issues. It can be a powerful tool in talking about police violence, but only if we can collect the data, analyze it, make sense of it, and tell a story about what's happening. And so that's the work that I've been doing.
Yeah. And I'd have my notes here. Also, there was something else that you really stuck with me the last time you spoke. So you're talking about like if you weren't doing the work that you were doing, I think you said you wanted to go on to be an astrophysicist. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you mentioned how you felt that this work, or not really the work, but how I guess the environment we're in kind of took you away from your dreams in a way. And so that really had me thinking about, you know, mission versus career. Like we have an idea of what we want to do, but then there's something in our lives that just happens that we get put on this mission. You know, I've been experiencing that recently. And I really just want to dwell on that a little bit. Like, do you feel like your dream has been deferred of being an astrophysicist? Do you still think about being one? And like, do you feel, like, how do you feel now about that?
I mean, like this is like deep stuff, right? Like I feel like this is, that is what like I wanted to do. I loved like learning about, you know, the planets and all, you know, black holes and Stephen Hawking at the time. And like, I was all into that, like, and like the data around that. But, you know, ultimately, you know, that seemed like such a distant thing, right? Like that seems so, I guess, esoteric, right? Like it's like out there, it exists. It's like a thought experiment. It's interesting. It's real, right? Like physics, how we exist, like it informs our world, but it seems like such a distant concept compared to, it's so theoretical compared to like the very real life and death reality of police violence, of structural racism in our country. So I felt like, one, based on my personal experience, it was more relevant to me to focus on those issues primarily because they seemed of primary importance to my life and to the lives of people, you know, around me that I care about, that look like me. And I think beyond that, I think, there is, you get to this point where you do have to ask like deep questions about, am I being driven by trauma, right? Is that healthy to be driven by trauma, or to be doing what you're doing out of really like trying to address some of the challenges and traumas and violence that you've experienced or that you've seen. And like, what does it mean on top of that, that like the work that I do is actually like itself extremely traumatic, right? Like, not only is it like informed by, and like in some cases driven by a deep understanding of and an experience with injustice, but it's also like my day to day is like reading through descriptions and articles and statements, arrest reports, and information about people who've been killed by the police, right? Like that is, I mean, we're talking about nearly 11,000 cases since 2013 that I've reviewed. I mean, literally, like nearly every person who's been killed by police in this country since 2013, I've read through their story. To some extent, I've read through the description of what happened. I've helped to code information about that and find, information about the officers and all. I mean, that's like the data collection piece of the work, not even the analysis and the visualization, the storytelling and the advocacy, which itself has those components. So yeah, I mean, it's not an easy, thing to do. It's not like it takes a mental toll on you. And it is traumatizing and informed by trauma. And like at some point, like there's gotta be, we have to figure out like, how do we, like there's like the self-care and like, how do we like, go to therapy, and like, how do you deal with like some of these things personally? But there is like a broader conversation, I think, like as Black people about like, like in many ways, like we are disproportionately in the fields trying to address racial inequities that we've experienced, that we continue to experience, that continue to affect us by necessity, right? Like this is like a war and we're on the front lines because like this is life or death, right? And it's not by choice, right? Like it seems by choice, like you pick your career, whatever, but in reality, like there are forces at play that structure what careers we end up in, both institutional racism and the direct barriers, and then also the way in which those barriers affect your own psyche and understanding of what are the key priorities in our country that need to be addressed. So yeah, this is like a bigger thing than me, but I think, that's how it's impacted me.
No, I definitely want to like add to that, because you definitely said a lot of things that resonated even before, and even more now. We're going a little bit deeper into it because I've actually asked you about it. And also just on my journey, and then just, today, or actually last night and today, I was commenting on someone who made a post kind of touching on that. Like, a lot of times we're on these missions, and a lot of them are driven by personal experiences and us wanting to make the world better for other people. And we need to sometimes take a step back, balance ourselves, because a lot of times we're so driven by the mission, driven by wanting to make the world a better place. And instead of feeling, I guess, traumatized or hurt, we figure, okay, you know what? If I just make that one last connection or have this one last conversation with Sam, I'm doing something for the greater good. But at the same time, there comes a place where we have to just say, you know what? I'm not doing anything today. I'm just going to take a step back and be Allen or be Sam and just, chill, and so it's, yeah, I didn't expect this answer and this train of thought, but yeah, this is definitely something that I feel a lot of people, and I guess one of the next questions I would like to ask is like, what advice do you give someone who's, who finds themselves at the intersection of data and social justice? I mean, I think it's a really great intersection to be at. I think it's something that is needed for people who are in a level of activism. But yeah, what advice do you give to people who are doing this work? And, I'll leave it open like that.
Yeah. So I think, particularly for folks who are thinking about getting into this work or are sort of the beginning stages, one of the key lessons has been don't wait for permission, because I think, like I'm 32 years old. I'm like not like tenured professor of law at like Columbia University for the past 30 years of like criminality or whatever. But like the reality was that the government wasn't tracking people who were being killed by the police in a systematic way. A lot of the sort of legacy groups and like national groups at the time were spending a lot of time and focus on trying to lobby the government to do a better job of collecting that data. Researchers were writing papers about the fact that the federal government doesn't have good data. But nobody was actually trying to solve the problem of like collecting the data that the federal government wasn't collecting. It was like talking about it, trying to get the government to do a better job, which by the way, they still haven't done. Like they still don't have a comprehensive database despite all that pressure. So like that was not necessarily the most fruitful pathway to getting the data, I think. So it was just don't wait for permission. Like, is there a way to get this data? It turns out that they're being reported in local news articles, and you can find them systematically with a system of Google alerts. And it turns out that according to recent research, that was comprehensive of more than 90% of the total estimated people killed by police in the country. So there was a way to get it. The information, it did exist. It just hadn't been compiled in a systematic way. There were some gaps in it. Hadn't been a story that had been told. So it was just diving right in and seeing like this is a national crisis. There is a need for data. The government's not providing it, and like we're not going to wait for some other person to do this work for us, or the government to do it for us, or like we have to do this. This is life or death. We need to have this information so we could help move solutions. And so I think that's a big lesson. There's no funding. There was like no. Like it was nothing. Like it was literally like it was a free trial version of Tableau and like a free trial version of Squarespace, and like that was it. Like the whole thing was like maybe like $50, $100 total to like build website and like collect like Microsoft Excel. Just like so, just find off the shelf ways to like use your creativity and your passion for this issue and your expertise to just do the thing, to build the database, to build the website, to build the visualization. I think in many cases, like we get bogged down by systems and institutions that are constantly requiring us to ask their permission for us to build anything, and in the process sort of water down or de-radicalize or sort of push us aside and push our ideas aside or co-opt them. And I think that like we need to authentically be ourselves, our best selves, and like do this work and not be afraid of that.
No, I hear that. I think a lot of times too, some of us has been in such, structured career journeys or structured career paths that sometimes, we do kind of think in that way, especially us who've been in more formalized careers longer, maybe than others. No, that was definitely, so I'm trying to think. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed that advice that you gave. I took notes for myself. Don't wait. I guess another thing is, are you still a one-man team, or have you always been a one-man team? I don't know if that's clear for a lot of us in terms of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a one-man team. So I have an organization. Mapping Police Violence is an organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. Like I am lucky enough to have like a number of really talented researchers and organizers who I work with and lead. So no, but that being said, I think, there is sort of like this idea that you need like a huge infrastructure and like a huge organization or an institution, right? Like this idea of like you need to have all of these things in a row before you can even start to have a voice or even start to make an impact or even start to like do original research. And I think that actually isn't true, right? I think that, I was literally just a person who saw articles about the fact the government didn't have a database and like went about collecting this information, right? And I think that is like it's totally within your power to do something similar. And there are a whole bunch of issues that there's not good data on. Like not only, criminal justice in general, like beyond just policing, jails, prisons, what happens to people once they get out, yeah, access to opportunities after people are like re-entering society, information on policies and practices is like, I mean, extremely, extremely thin, right? And that's information that is critical to researchers, critical to organizers. And there's not like a good nationwide database where you can go and see, you know, this is my city, and my city, you know, these are all the policies that they have in place. This is how it compares to other places. This is like these are the trends across all of these different criminal justice outcomes that matter, is what it means. Like there's basic like data and information that can help you be really strategic about organizing an advocacy that's just not being provided, and that we can play a role in making accessible to people.
Yeah. Any recent wins or impacts that you'd like to share with us?
So there are a couple things. So one of the things that is most interesting to me right now is this conversation around alternatives to the police. And you know, there are now alternatives being piloted, at least in many of the nation's largest cities. So you have mental health clinicians who respond to calls where people are having mental health crises instead of the police. You have places where the people who are called, so if let's say you have a store and the store owner calls you know, the 911 to report somebody who's homeless or something, they will send like a street response team that doesn't have a police officer to the scene instead of a police officer. So what is interesting is that in the state of California now, they have enacted the Crises Act. The Crises Act is the first statewide program that gives dedicated grant funding to alternatives, to scale those alternative programs across the state. And as part of their mandate, they're required to distribute those grants to the places that have the worst policing outcomes. So places that have the worst racial disparities, the highest rates of police use of force, the least accountability when it comes to misconduct complaints. And so one of the wins is that, you know, the California Department of Social Services, which is administering the program, is using the police scorecard data. They're using the data that we produce to understand which places they should be making those investments. And that's like a key example of, I think, how data can be a tool for really making sure that we're targeting resources and investments to communities that need them most, to communities that are most impacted by policing, police violence. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Do you feel a lot of organizations in your space, are they becoming more data literate in your opinion, or do you still feel there is a need for an increase of that?
I think that there's sort of a like a divide, I think, in the advocacy and organizing space. I think that there are some national organizations that have a lot of resources that are now able to do more research. So these are like these are like the Vera or like Brennan Center, you know, like large organization, even ACLU, like they're able to like leverage all the resources to put out like data-driven reports around. So like, for example, Vera put out a report on jail incarceration that helped to visualize jail incarceration rates across the country in a way that hadn't been accessible before. So I think that some of that research is now being produced, but like on the ground, like in terms of grassroots, in terms of like everyday organizations, community organizations that don't have like $1 million budgets or aren't national in scope, I think that there's still a need to find data, to have data. I think data can still add a lot of value to their work. And part of the challenge with that is that it's hard to find really good locally relevant data. So a lot of like the national researchers, academics, and groups will put out these big national reports. But if you wanted to find out like how the data broke down for Nashville, because you're a Nashville organizer, like you wouldn't be able to find that in that research paper. So I think that there's still a gap in terms of making information really accessible and actionable for people at the local level, given just how, you know, there are 18,000 different jurisdictions. So, you know, each local organizer needs like their own data set and information that is locally relevant to them.
Yeah. Have you found that you have other organizations using the databases that you've put together?
Yeah, I mean, mapping police violence is in many ways the standard. I mean, there have been, I mean, if you go to mappingpoliceviolence.us, you can see just a sampling of the research papers that have recently come out using mapping police violence data. I mean, currently technically there are three databases that track killings by the police to some extent. Like there's the Washington Post one, but it doesn't include killings by police that don't involve like a police shooting. It also only goes back to 2015, so it doesn't go back further, which ours does. There's Fatal Encounters, which has been like OG. They've been around for a while. I mean, they have a very expansive reporting system, but they haven't updated their data at all this year. And I'm not sure if they're going to resume their tracking, like when they might resume their tracking. And then there's like Mapping Police Violence. So the only other database is the Gun Violence Archive, which is relatively underutilized, but has a lot of cases, but they're not really clean. So there's a lot of work. They like have a list of articles. There's not really any detail for analysis. So there's like not like that many data sources. And particularly now that we've expanded to include non-fatal use of force, like there are like no other data sources that track this across the country in this way. And so it is a key resource in that way. Like there's not like it is a primary source to get like a lot of this information on police use of force.
Okay. Well, I definitely thank you personally for all the work that you've been doing to make this more transparent, to make it easier to begin to analyze. As we begin to wrap up our conversation, is there any last words that you have or ways that we can learn more about you and your organization that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so the organization's Mapping Police Violence. We have two like primary data projects. One is at mappingpoliceviolence.us, which is a database of killings by the police, and then the Police Scorecard project, which is much broader, has a lot of additional data for now we have 16,000 of the nation's 18,000 jurisdictions. So you can go to policescorecard.org. I encourage you to check it out. You can contact me directly. There's a email link on the site, but certainly like get the data, see where data might be missing for your city or county. Also, that's also interesting because like that could be an opportunity to push for more transparency at the local level. And then more importantly, use that data to make the case for improvements for reducing use of force, increasing accountability, and ultimately creating alternatives that actually keep people safe.
No, good. Yeah, I've definitely already started using your scorecard database. I've used it for a few class examples where we're talking about data storytelling. So I've definitely started playing with that. But again, Sam, I just want to really thank you again for sitting down with us, talking about data and the intersection of social justice, also getting a little existential there with the mission versus careers. It's always fun having conversation with you. So again, I just want to thank you, and I can't wait to share this with the audience.